Now, a format that is certainly very familiar for many places on YouTube as well as elsewhere is reacting to what, say, celebrities or movie characters are wearing on their wrist. And to be honest, sometimes I find this a little bit redundant because everybody has the same thing on their wrist. I thought it'd be interesting to go ahead and kind of reverse engineer this idea. Look at a certain type of character and develop based on their lifestyle as well as maybe some aspects of their personality, pick out the best watch for them. And I figured the best place to start would pick out some of the most iconic movie characters of all time and give them a watch or recommend a watch that'd be very fitting on their wrist. If you have not seen these movies, just know I'm gonna talk a little bit about some of the plots because I wanna really tie in some of the ideas of why these watches I think fit for that type of individual, their personality, and what goes on in the film. Now, since this is a video about watches and movies, I feel like I should mention a watch that's on teddybaldassarre.com that is also featured in a movie, that movie being Interstellar with the Hamilton Murph. So this is a watch that has a lot of tie-ins to the movie Interstellar. This was one of a couple watches that was featured in that film and has been a fan favorite ever since, and even has some cool tie-ins, including the Morse code Eureka being written out on the seconds hand, which I think is a really nice touch and close attention to detail. And this is just one of those examples of that. Check it out on teddybaldassarre.com, as well as 30 other brands that we are an authorized dealer of, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, also offer a full factory warranty. So if anything goes wrong, you're completely covered. Check it out, teddybaldassarre.com. So for our first character here, we have archaeologist and adventurer Indiana Jones, and probably maybe the most famous movie character of all time, at least up there probably. So every single one of these watches, I wanna have a list of requirements that I think embody what should be on the wrist of this individual. When you're talking about Indiana Jones, I think we also have to probably be true to the period. So first requirement, 1930s is really where we're gonna be starting to look at in terms of watches available during that just kind of era. This watch also needs to be legible. It needs to be durable. Given the many adventures that he goes on, he can't be worrying about not being able to read the watch or worried about banging the thing around. Also, the watch needs to be understated because pretty much everything else about his attire is straightforward and nothing flash about it. He's just kind of effortlessly cool with his approach. And finally, I think we need to go for an American-made watch, considering that it's of the era where many American brands are going to be out there. Also, when considering other parts of his attire, like the Alden boots that he's wearing, known as the Alden Indy boots, now from a modern context, very famous boots out there, and I know a favorite of mine as well, pretty cool. Now, a lot of people probably are considering just going for a field watch from Hamilton, but given that these movies are based in the mid to late 1930s, and Hamilton truly started to develop this type of reputation around field watches during World War II, I think it would be better to look elsewhere within Hamilton's catalog, and that is the Hamilton Flintridge. So in recent years, we've seen a reissue of this watch. It's no longer actually being made, but we did see it. And when looking at the previous versions, the vintage versions of when these were produced, first unveiled in the early 1930s in an era where things like the Reverso were also being released. So the reason why I like this for Indy is for a few reasons. One, is historically accurate. This was a time and era where this design style was popularized for the likes of the Reverso. This is going to protect that crystal on the inside. Also, when you're talking about the dial, very traditional, large markers. It's gonna have great legibility. So I think this is a perfect fit for him. And also relatively pretty understated as a watch, but the protection against dust, bangs, and maybe going through caves and things of that sort, this watch just makes a ton of sense, while also being American made at the time, considering Hamilton had its production in Lancaster, Pennsylvania until 1969. So this would be my pick for Indiana Jones, and I think it would look great on his wrist. Now, next up, we have one of the more iconic movie characters from a teenager perspective from the 1980s. We have Ferris Bueller. Now, in terms of how I would classify it, and this requirements for what would look good on Ferris Bueller, I think something needs to be affordable. I think it has to be a bit quirky, kind of trickster in terms of what it's going for. It has to have 80s undertones in some manner. It needs to be lighthearted, can't take itself too seriously, and also goes against the grain. Now, the watch that I would go for there would probably be a red swatch, just considering that there's, hey, he's driving around a Ferrari during the actual movie, so I think that makes sense. But honestly, I think the better choice here, this is kind of my true pick, is the Timex 25-hour watch. Now, this was a watch that was unveiled in recent history on April Fool's Day, but when you talk about Ferris Bueller kind of, figuring out ways, he's kind of savvy and just kind of pulls pranks and tricks and kind of has everybody convinced he's sick and just the whole backstory of that, I feel like a watch needs to be almost reflective of that type of personality as what he does in the entire film. And this to me feels like that type of watch. It's an affordable watch, so it checks it off there. It also is a bit quirky, it's different. Of course, having some fun with that 25th hour. It essentially doesn't actually have a 25th hour. They basically just replaced the 24 with a 25. Not as strong with the swatch, but still can see it. I don't think this would look out of place in the 1980s on his wrist. And also, it goes against the grain. But for me, this just feels like the watch that he would decide to wear. Not necessarily the style of it, more of just what the watch represents and kind of its lighthearted nature and not taking itself too seriously while having a little trick in the process. Now, next up, we have Forrest Gump. And Forrest Gump as a character is pretty tough to pick out a watch for because he just changes so much during the movie. But I have to pick out just one area that makes sense the most when it comes to having a watch and tying it to the type of life that he was living at the time. And that was his time as a soldier during the Vietnam War. So with that being the case, here are my requirements for what this watch needs to entail. For one, it needs to be a watch that was actually worn during the Vietnam War. It has to match his attire, legible, durable, and also it should have multiple time zones because considering Forrest Gump, he's always thinking about Jenny, he's thinking about life back home all the time. I just feel like he'd want to be able to look at a glance and see, what time was back at home. So I feel like that 24-hour scale and being able to check a different time zone is going to be crucial. And with that being the case, I think the Glycine Airman is going to be the one to go for. Now, this watch was first unveiled in 1953 as a watch that really was a trailblazer and doesn't necessarily get the amount of appreciation that it deserves as a watch with really kind of formatting that 24-hour scale on the outside of that bezel. But it wasn't until the Vietnam War where these really became loved watches, and partially was because of their actual utility by specifically US soldiers. Now, these were available at different PXs during the Vietnam War, one of the more popular watches that you would find on the wrist of soldiers during this period. And if I had to think of the watch that probably be best suited on Forrest Gump's wrist, this would be the one. For our next character, we have newscaster Ron Burgundy. Now, this is a pretty silly one, but in terms of what I would be looking for requirements here is pretty much everything that he wears is on the nose, burgundy, red, so I feel like this watch needs to also follow suit there. I think the watch also needs to be a bit dressier and kind of match his suit attire. Also needs to be reflective of the 1970s, whether it is a watch from that period or would look great in that period. And then finally, just like Ron himself, we need to go for something that has some classiness to it with just how he approaches himself while being a little bit of a hard person to contain, so some flair and some exotic nature to what he is wearing. Now, the first option here that I wanted to go for is with the JLC Reverso Tribute Small Seconds in burgundy or red. Now, this is a dial that I think would look fantastic with his variety of burgundy suits. The other reason why I like this is the design that pretty much stems back to the original 1931 design. And when you're considering something that would look really the part in the 1970s, I think this would still look good. Of course, might be a little bit on the nose that you're going for a red dial watch on a guy that's always wearing burgundy suits. But hey, I think that makes sense considering just what he typically goes for with the rest of his attire. And just as another honorable mention, I was struggling whether or not this should take it or the Reverso, but I decided on the Reverso. I think would probably be the better option. Talking about the Rolex Day-Date Stella dials, mostly the one in Oxblood, kind of have to match again, but these were watches that kind of epitomize this era. I was afraid that this was gonna be a little bit too ostentatious, even for Ron Burgundy, but I think this would certainly work as well, but typically these are gonna be found in yellow gold, and with that type of connection, it just makes a statement that I don't know would be the best on his wrist. Not sure, but I think that certainly could be another point of consideration. For our next character here, we have Hannibal Lecter. Now, I'm looking at both the movies, whether we're talking about Silence of the Lambs, Red Dragon, as well as maybe even looking at the TV show. I'm a big fan of the series, so would want to really kind of think about this from the holistic view of who he is as a character. So in terms of what I think are the requirements for a watch like this, he's a man that is certainly sophisticated. Also, I feel like he's an individual that would never go kind of with the status quo. He wants something that's unique, uncommon. I also think he needs a watch that's gonna be great with functional timing of events and dates and things of that nature, as well as maybe when he's in the kitchen cooking. don't ask what's on the menu. In addition, he's more of a connoisseur and savant, so he will have an appreciation for finer things, as well as something that I believe probably is good value as well, but also is going to be a luxury product at the end of the day. And since he was born in the 1930s, I believe that we also want to get something that is a little bit historically intact. And the watch that I think would be great on his wrist is the Universal Genève Tri-Compax. Now, the reason why I think this watch just works so well is just the function that comes along with it. Of course, it's a luxury product. If you see a watch like this on somebody's wrist, then you know that they have kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit. And for somebody that comes off as somebody who's very well read, is learning as much as they can about a particular subject, this would be the type of watch that I would see on his wrist. But in addition to that, you're also getting a triple calendar chronograph with a moon phase. So you're getting a lot of functionality. You can use the chronograph for timing different events, whether you're talking about, meeting with a patient, knowing, say, when the 30 minutes or an hour is up, or also just dealing with a nice schedule when you have a triple calendar that is, of course, going to be useful for keeping tight grip on your time, while also offering up some great functionality for his, say, questionable lifestyle. And now for our final character, we have Vito Corleone from The Godfather. My requirements here for this watch, so this needs to be an heirloom piece. This is a man that was all about the family and being able to pass things down, whether it's the family business or the watch that's on his wrist, so I think that's very important. You, of course, want something that's going to be timeless, but also reflective of the 1940s and the era in which the movie was based. And finally, we want a watch that can just match the effortless, cool, and sprezzatura of this character. And I think the best example of that is with the Patek Philippe Calatrava, the 2406, with a Tiffany dial, and I think that's important. Now, given that the Corleone family is going to be really building their empire in New York, I think it's important to get a Tiffany dial Patek Calatrava for a few reasons. One, when you're talking about an heirloom piece, I believe Patek is probably one of the watches that comes to mind as maybe the pinnacle of that. You can even see it with their advertising. You don't necessarily own a Patek Philippe watch, you just look after for the next generation. I think that kind of allows it to set the stage there as a man who really prides himself on family and being able to pass things down. Everything that he was doing was not for himself, but really thinking about also how the big picture of the family would be affected in addition to that. This is as timeless as it gets. And finally, the Tiffany dial. I think that's the connection that also makes a ton of sense, given that this is probably the most famous New York jeweler that is going to be out there. And when you're able to tie that in with the Corleone family building their empire in New York, it just makes a ton of sense. This is a watch that personally I think would look great on his wrist. It's under the radar, but totally classy in every aspect about it, while also being something he can pass on to his son as well. But okay guys, that is my list looking at some recommendations of watches for iconic movie characters. Now, know this was different, but if you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Just want to have a bit more fun. And if you do give it a thumbs up, that's a great indicator for me if you do want to see more of this. If you don't want to see more of it, then, maybe give it a thumbs down. Just want to know what you guys think of this. I had a lot of fun putting this together. It really got me thinking about, what was the personality and just lifestyle of these individuals and what would be a good watch to pair with that. Also check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of over 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support. Also offer a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. We offer price match, so if you see one of our watches for cheaper at another authorized dealer, fill out the form, we'll get in touch with you, and 9 out of every $10 that we generate goes right back into the content that we're creating, trying to foster up a new generation of watch enthusiasts in the process. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.